For 10,000 years, they told us the Emperor was watching, that he held the Imperium together with his will alone. But what if I told you he is not enduring at all? That the Golden Throne is not a sanctuary, but a feeding machine? That every day, 1,000 souls are burned just to keep him from collapsing completely? This is not a story about faith. It is about what happens when you learn the cost of survival and realize you were never supposed to know. I received the summons on a morning when the sky above Macrage's secondary archive complex burned the color of old parchment. The vellum seal bore marks I had only seen in historical records, symbols that predated the current High Lords by millennia, and beneath the ornate calligraphy lay a simple directive that made my hands tremble as I held it. Report to Terra within the month. Bring nothing. Tell no one. The Inquisition had work for me, work that required discretion and a particular expertise in pre-heresy documentation, and though I had spent 15 years cataloguing the forgotten margins of imperial history, I had never imagined my name would surface in such circles. Marvian Hale, junior archivist, specialist in administrative records from the Unification Wars, a man whose greatest achievement was reconstructing supply chain manifests from the siege of Terra using water-damaged fragments and educated guesswork. I was not a warrior. I was not a saint. I was simply someone who understood how empires kept their paperwork, how truth hid in ledgers and requisition forms, how the past whispered through bureaucracy when grander narratives fell silent. The journey to Terra took 6 weeks aboard a cramped transport that smelled of recycled air and human anxiety. I shared quarters with a dozen other passengers, none of whom spoke much, all of whom carried the same haunted expression of people summoned to the throne world for reasons they did not fully understand. We passed through the warp in silence, and I spent my days reviewing what little I knew about inquisitorial protocols, trying to imagine what kind of archive work could require such secrecy. At night, I dreamed of documents burning, of endless corridors filled with scrolls that turned to ash as I reached for them, and I woke each time with the taste of smoke in my mouth, though the air filtration systems kept our quarters pristine. When we finally emerged into real space and Terra filled the viewports like a scarred grey jewel wrapped in orbital fortresses and defense platforms, I felt something close to religious terror settle into my chest. This was the heart of everything. The place where humanity's last hope sat enthroned in golden agony. The truth was closer than I imagined. They brought me down through layers of security that made my credentials seem laughable. Scanners and gene locks and servo skull verification at every checkpoint, until I stood in an antechamber deep beneath the palace itself, in a section of the catacombs I could not locate on any map. The Inquisitor who met me there introduced herself as Vestra Kaline, a woman whose augmetic eye glowed with a soft amber light and whose voice carried the clipped efficiency of someone who had long ago abandoned pleasantries. She told me I had been selected for a task of utmost importance, a project that touched upon the very foundations of the Imperium, and that my work over the next months would be classified at the highest levels. When I asked what exactly I would be analyzing, she gestured toward a door behind her, a massive slab of adamantium inscribed with warnings in 17 languages, and told me I would understand soon enough. The door opened with a hiss of ancient pneumatics, revealing a chamber beyond that stretched into darkness. And as I stepped forward, I caught the scent of something I could not name, something that reminded me of ozone and burnt flesh, and the peculiar metallic tang that clings to very old blood. The archive they showed me was unlike anything I had encountered in my career. The chamber extended far beyond what the initial doorway suggested, a vast space supported by columns of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and along every wall rose shelves stacked with data cores, parchment scrolls, crystalline memory matrices, and devices I did not recognize. Everything was labeled in the cryptic shorthand of the Administratum's most secretive branches, catalog numbers that meant nothing to me, and when I asked Kaline where to begin, she handed me a slate containing a list of specific documents I was to locate and decrypt. The first item on the list made my breath catch: Mechanicus Technical Schematic Theta 91, Primary Life Support Apparatus, Golden Throne, Layer 7 through 42. I looked up at her, searching for some indication that this was a test or a mistake, but her expression remained neutral. She told me the Inquisition required a comprehensive analysis of certain systems within the throne's infrastructure, systems that had been deemed too sensitive for standard review, and that my background in administrative archaeology made me uniquely suited to the task. She did not explain why such analysis was necessary now, after 10,000 years of relative stability. I began my work that afternoon, pulling data cores from their climate-controlled housing and interfacing them with the cogitator terminal they had provided. The first schematic I decrypted showed a cross-section of the Golden Throne's lower mechanisms, layers upon layers of machinery that descended into Terra's crust like roots seeking water, and as I traced the conduit pathways and power distribution networks, I noticed annotations in the margins, handwritten notes in a language I recognized as Proto-Gothic mixed with Mechanicus binary count. The notes described flow rates and energy consumption metrics, numbers so vast they seemed meaningless at first, until I realized they were describing the daily intake requirements of the throne itself. Psychic energy measured in units I had never seen, quantities that would require hundreds of psychers to generate, and beside these numbers someone had written a single word in red ink: insufficient. I stared at that word for a long time, trying to understand what it implied, and when I cross-referenced the schematic's date stamp with historical records, I discovered it had been compiled less than a century after the Emperor's internment. Even then, the throne was failing. Over the following weeks, I worked through document after document, each one pulling back another layer of carefully maintained deception. I found maintenance logs from the Adeptus Mechanicus detailing repairs to the throne's life support systems, reports that described catastrophic failures and emergency interventions, with the clinical detachment of engineers discussing a malfunctioning reactor. I found testimony from tech priests who had witnessed the Emperor's physical state during routine servicing, descriptions that matched no official account I had ever read. One report, filed by a magos whose name had been redacted, described the Emperor's body as being in a state of continuous cellular collapse, held together only by the throne's systems and by an unquantifiable psychic force that the magos compared to a star collapsing inward upon itself. The report concluded with a recommendation that alternative solutions be researched, as the current configuration was unsustainable beyond a 2,000-year operational window. That window had closed 8 millennia ago. But it was the testimony of the custodians that truly began to unsettle me. Hidden among technical reports and supply requisitions, I found a series of sealed declarations from members of the Adeptus Custodes, statements recorded shortly before their deaths, last words preserved in stasis-locked data crystals that required specialized equipment to access. The first testimony I opened was from a custodian named Valdor's Seventh Shadow, a warrior who had stood guard over the throne for 3 centuries before his service ended. His words were measured and precise, but beneath the formal language I detected something like grief. He described watching the Emperor's essence fracture and reform in cycles, great waves of psychic energy that pulsed through the throne chamber and left the attending tech priests bleeding from their eyes and ears. He described days when the Astronomicon flickered and entire sectors of the Imperium were plunged into warp shadow, moments of crisis when the throne's mechanisms screamed and the air itself seemed to tear. And he described the processions, the endless lines of psychers brought before the throne to be fed into its machinery, their souls consumed to patch the cracks in something that should never have been allowed to break. I worked alone most days, seeing Kalani only when she arrived to review my progress or deliver additional materials. She never asked what I was finding, never seemed surprised by my growing unease. And when I tried to discuss the implications of what I was reading, she reminded me that my task was analysis, not interpretation. But interpretation was unavoidable. Every document I decrypted painted the same picture, a truth so vast and terrible that I began to understand why it had been buried beneath layers of classification and threat of execution. The Emperor was not enduring, he was not healing, he was not in any meaningful sense alive. What sat upon the golden throne was something far stranger and more horrific, a being caught in a state between mortality and godhood, held in perpetual agony by machinery that both sustained and consumed him. And the price of maintaining this state was measured not in centuries or millennia but in human souls, thousands upon thousands of psychers sacrificed daily to fuel a system that grew more inefficient with each passing year. The numbers haunted me. I found ledgers from the Adeptus Astra Telepathica detailing the tithe of psychers, records that stretched back 10,000 years in an unbroken chain of requisitions and deliveries. In the early years following the heresy, the daily requirement had been modest, perhaps 50 or 60 psychers fed into the throne's machinery to maintain the Astronomican's light. But the numbers grew steadily, century by century, until by the current age the tithe exceeded 1,000 souls per day. 1,000 lives every single day, just to keep the Imperium's lighthouse burning. And even that was not enough. I found projections from the Mechanicus estimating future requirements. Models that predicted the need would double within 5 centuries, then double again, an exponential curve that terminated in a projection so bleak that whoever compiled it had marked the data crystal with a warning glyph, meaning ontological threat. The throne was not preserving the Emperor. It was slowly devouring him, and in doing so, it was devouring the Imperium's psychic future one soul at a time. But there was more. Hidden among the testimonies and technical schematics, I found references to something called the Reclamation Protocol, a project initiated by the Inquisition in collaboration with the highest ranks of the Mechanicus and sanctioned by at least 3 of the High Lords. The references were fragmentary, scattered across multiple documents, like pieces of a puzzle someone had tried to destroy but could not quite eliminate completely. From what I could reconstruct, the Reclamation Protocol was a contingency plan, a theoretical framework for what might be done if the Emperor's condition deteriorated beyond the throne's capacity to compensate. One memorandum spoke of alternative anchors for the Astronomican. Another discussed the theoretical possibility of a Gestalt consciousness, a psychic entity constructed from the collective will of trillions. And a third, chillingly, mentioned the necessity of preparing the populace for a fundamental shift in the nature of imperial worship, a transition that would require careful management and absolute information control. I should have stopped reading. I should have reported what I had found and requested reassignment, claimed the work was beyond my expertise, or that I lacked the proper mental conditioning to handle such material. But I could not stop. Every document I opened revealed another layer of conspiracy, another carefully concealed truth, and I became consumed by the need to understand the full scope of what I had uncovered. I worked through the nights, surviving on stim packs and recycled rations, and the archive around me began to feel less like a repository of knowledge and more like a tomb, a place where dangerous truths had been buried in the hope they would never be disturbed. The air grew colder as I descended deeper into the classified materials. The lights seemed dimmer, and sometimes, in the silence between my own thoughts, I imagined I could hear something breathing in the darkness beyond the chamber's walls, a vast and terrible presence that knew I was there and was waiting to see what I would do with what I had learned. It was Kaline who finally broke my isolation. She arrived one morning as I was reviewing a particularly disturbing testimony from a Sister of Silence who had been present during an emergency intervention when the throne suffered a major failure. The Sister's account described the Emperor's psychic scream, a wave of telepathic agony that killed every psyker within 100 meters and left the surviving attendants catatonic for days. Kaline read over my shoulder for a moment, then sat down across from me, her augmetic eye whirring as it focused. She asked if I understood what I was reading, and I told her I thought I did. The Emperor was not immortal. He was imprisoned in a state of perpetual death, maintained by machinery and sacrifice, and the Imperium's greatest lie was that this state represented endurance rather than torture. Kaline nodded slowly, and then she told me why I had really been summoned to Terra. The Reclamation Protocol was not theoretical anymore, it was active. The Inquisition, working with elements of the Mechanicus and certain High Lords who understood the true fragility of the Imperium's foundations, had been developing a replacement for the Emperor, a new psychic anchor that could maintain the Astronomican without requiring the physical presence of a dying demigod. The plan was audacious and horrifying in equal measure. They intended to create a Gestalt entity from the psychic resonance of the entire human species, a collective consciousness forged from trillions of souls across thousands of worlds, bound together through a combination of technology and warp manipulation that pushed the boundaries of what the Mechanicus deemed possible. The Emperor would be allowed to finally die, his millennia of suffering ended, and in his place would rise something new, something that might prove more stable and sustainable. But the transition would require unprecedented coordination, absolute secrecy, and a level of psychic sacrifice that made the current tithe of psychers seem merciful by comparison. The initial activation would consume billions. I stared at Kaline as she explained this, searching her face for some indication that she was testing my loyalty or gauging my reaction to deliberate misinformation. But her expression remained flat and professional. She told me that my analysis of the archives had been essential in confirming the feasibility of certain technical aspects, that my work had helped identify critical weaknesses in the throne's infrastructure that could be exploited to facilitate the transition. She told me I should feel proud, that I had contributed to perhaps the most important undertaking in the Imperium's history, a project that could ensure humanity's survival for another 10,000 years. And then she told me that my next task was to help prepare the documentation that would justify the reclamation protocol to the remaining High Lords who had not yet been briefed, to craft a narrative that would make the unthinkable seem not only necessary but inevitable. I refused. The word left my mouth before I fully understood what I was saying, a simple monosyllable that hung in the air between us like a weapon. I told Kaline that I would not participate in a project designed to murder the Emperor and replace him with some untested warp abomination. I told her that what she described was heresy of the highest order, a betrayal of everything the Imperium claimed to stand for. I told her that if the Emperor truly was suffering, the answer was to find a way to heal him, not to kill him and build something else in his place. My voice rose as I spoke, echoing in the vast chamber, and I realized I was shouting, all the weeks of horror and exhaustion and moral revulsion pouring out in a torrent of accusation. Kaline listened without interruption, her expression never changing, and when I finally fell silent, she reached into her coat and drew a compact las pistol that gleamed in the dim light. She did not point it at me. She simply held it, letting me see it, and her voice when she spoke was almost gentle. She told me that she understood my reaction, that many of those briefed on the reclamation protocol experienced similar distress, but that ultimately my cooperation was not optional. She explained that everyone involved in the project had been selected not only for their expertise but for their isolation, their lack of significant personal connections that might complicate necessary operational security. She explained that I had been chosen in part because my family was long dead, my colleagues few and distant, my life dedicated so completely to archival work that my disappearance would barely register, and she explained that if I continued to refuse, I would not simply be dismissed or reassigned. I would be classified as a security risk and eliminated along with everyone else who had worked on the project's initial phases, a purge that would erase all evidence of the reclamation protocol until such time as it was ready for broader implementation. The lights in the chamber flickered once, and somewhere in the distance I heard the hum of machinery changing pitch. Kaline told me I had 1 hour to reconsider, that she would return and expect my full cooperation. Then she holstered her weapon and walked toward the adamantium door, her footsteps echoing in the silence. I watched her leave, watched the door seal behind her, and then I was alone in the archive with the weight of 10,000 years of terrible truth pressing down on me. I looked at the documents scattered across my workspace, the testimony of custodians and tech priests and psychers who had died maintaining a lie, and I understood that everything I had believed about the Imperium was built on a foundation of suffering so vast it defied comprehension. The Emperor was not a god preserving humanity through his eternal vigil. He was a corpse being slowly consumed by a machine, and the light that guided humanity through the warp was fueled by daily atrocity. I did not have time to process the full implications of what I had learned. The hour Kaline had given me was not mercy, it was procedure. A documented period of reflection meant to demonstrate that coercion had been minimized and that any subsequent cooperation was technically voluntary. But I knew what would happen if I waited. I had read enough inquisitorial protocols to understand how these situations resolved. Compliance meant complicity, refusal meant death, and either way the truth would remain buried, unless someone acted. Unless someone refused to let this knowledge die in the dark, I began gathering documents. Not the data cores or crystalline matrices that required specialized equipment to read, but physical copies, parchment and printouts that I could carry, materials that represented irrefutable proof of what I had discovered. I selected carefully, choosing testimonies that were clear and damning, technical schematics that showed the throne's deteriorating condition, and fragments of the Reclamation Protocol documents that outlined the Inquisition's intentions. I stuffed them into my coat, layers of forbidden knowledge pressed against my chest, and then I turned toward the secondary exit Kaline had shown me during my first week, a service corridor used by maintenance servitors that connected to the greater catacomb network beneath the palace. The door was locked, but the locking mechanism was old and designed to keep people out rather than in. I forced it open with a pry bar I found among the archive's maintenance supplies, the metal shrieking as it gave way, and then I was running, stumbling through corridors that had not seen human traffic in centuries. The catacombs beneath the Imperial Palace are older than the Imperium itself, layers of construction built atop ancient structures that predate Unity, and as I fled through their darkness, I understood that I was descending into Terra's true history. The walls around me bore marks from a dozen eras, graffiti in languages long extinct, blast scars from wars that had been forgotten before the Emperor walked, and everywhere the silence pressed close like something living. I, navigating by instinct and desperation, following corridors that sloped downward, avoiding the main passages where I might encounter patrols or servitors, and behind me I heard alarms beginning to sound, distant at first but growing closer. They had discovered my escape faster than I had hoped. The purge protocol had begun. I lost track of time in those tunnels. Minutes blurred into hours, and I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to collapse, and still I pushed forward because stopping meant capture, and capture meant everything I had risked would be erased. I passed through chambers filled with ancient machinery that hummed with unknown purpose, through corridors lined with the desiccated remains of people who had died here long ago, through spaces so vast my handlight could not illuminate their far walls. And gradually, I became aware that I was not alone. I heard footsteps behind me, the measured tread of hunters who did not need to hurry because they knew these tunnels far better than I did. I heard voices echoing through the dark, cold, and professional, coordinating their search with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. The Inquisition had sent kill teams after me, specialists in urban elimination, and they were closing the distance with every passing minute. But the catacombs were vast, far larger than I had imagined. And as I descended, I found passages that seemed to defy the laws of geometry, corridors that twisted back on themselves or opened into chambers that should not have been able to exist given the architecture above. I realized I was approaching something, some central structure around which the rest of the palace had been built, and the air grew warmer and heavier with each step. I began to smell that scent again, ozone and burnt flesh and old blood, stronger now, pervasive, and I understood with a clarity that felt like religious vision that I was descending toward the throne itself. Not the public face of the throne chamber where pilgrims and officials gathered, but the deep mechanisms, the foundations where the real work of keeping a dying god alive took place. I found the first psychers in a chamber 3 levels below the main catacomb network. They were arranged in rows, hundreds of them, each one sealed in a coffin-like apparatus connected to the ceiling by cables as thick as a man's arm. Their faces were visible through transparent panels, expressions slack and distant, and as I moved closer, I saw that their eyes were moving rapidly beneath closed lids, dreaming dreams no human should endure. These were not the psychers being fed into the throne for consumption. These were the stockpile, the reserve meant to ensure uninterrupted supply should something disrupt the regular tithe. Living souls held in suspension, waiting their turn to be burned as fuel for a failing star. I stood among them, surrounded by hundreds of dreamers, and I felt the weight of what I was seeing threaten to crush me. This was the truth behind the Imperium's survival. This was the price humanity paid for its faltering light. I could hear my pursuers growing closer, their voices echoing through the corridors behind me, and I knew I had only minutes left. I pulled the documents from my coat, spreading them across the floor of the chamber, and I activated the Vox recorder built into my data slate, ancient technology that could interface with both Imperial and pre-Unity communication networks if properly configured. I had no way of knowing if the signal would reach anyone, if it would be intercepted before it could escape the palace's shielding, but I had to try. I began speaking, my voice rough from exertion and fear, describing everything I had learned, everything the Inquisition had tried to hide. I spoke about the Emperor's true condition, about the thousands of psychers consumed daily, about the Reclamation Protocol and the plan to replace humanity's dying god with an untested Gestalt consciousness that would require billions of deaths to activate. I spoke until I heard footsteps entering the chamber, until I saw the Lassites painting my chest with red light, and then I transmitted everything, broadcasting it on every frequency my data slate could reach, hurling the truth into the void and praying that someone, somewhere, would hear it before it was erased. The first lashbolt struck me in the shoulder, spinning me around, and I fell among the documents I had scattered, blood soaking into parchment covered with testimony and schematics. I looked up and saw Kaline standing in the chamber's entrance, her last pistol still raised, her expression unchanged. She walked toward me slowly, flanked by kill team members in unmarked armor, and she told me I had made things unnecessarily difficult, that the Purge protocol would now need to be expanded to cover anyone who might have intercepted my transmission, that my attempt to expose the truth would result only in more death. I tried to speak, tried to tell her that truth could not be killed as easily as a lone archivist, but blood filled my mouth, and the words came out as choking sounds. She knelt beside me, her augmetic eye whirring as it focused, and she told me one final thing before the darkness closed in. The Reclamation Protocol would proceed regardless of my actions. The Emperor's death had already been scheduled, and when it happened, when the Gestalt consciousness rose to take his place, the Imperium would declare it a miracle. They would call it the Emperor's rebirth, and anyone who suggested otherwise would be executed as a heretic. I felt my consciousness fading, the chamber around me dissolving into grey static, and in my final moments I thought about all the psychers sleeping in their coffins, about the billions who would die in the name of humanity's survival, about the vast lie that held the Imperium together like mortar holding bricks. I thought about the Emperor, trapped for 10,000 years in agony beyond comprehension, and I wondered if he had known this would be the cost. If he had foreseen the machine, he would become and accepted it anyway, because the alternative was extinction. I thought about the transmission I had sent, about the slim possibility that someone would hear it and understand, that some fragment of truth would survive in the margins of history where I had spent my life searching for it. The darkness came gently, like falling asleep after exhausting labor. My last sensation was of warmth spreading through my body, and I thought perhaps this was what the psychers felt when the throne consumed them, this gradual dissolution into something larger than themselves. I hoped it did not hurt. I hoped they did not understand what was being done to them. I hoped that somewhere in the vast machinery of the Imperium's lies there was still room for mercy. But I knew better. I had read the testimony. I had seen the schematics. I had decoded the truth that everyone else refused to acknowledge. The Emperor's immortality was not endurance, it was Holocaust made eternal, and the Imperium survived only by feeding its god the souls he had sworn to protect. My transmission lasted 7 seconds before the palace's security systems isolated and purged it from all major communication networks. 7 seconds during which my voice, desperate and breaking, described what I had found in the archives beneath Terra. 7 seconds of truth broadcast across dozens of frequencies, scattered into the electromagnetic noise that filled Imperial space like the background radiation of some ancient catastrophe. Most of those 7 seconds were intercepted and deleted by automated systems designed specifically to prevent unauthorized transmissions from the palace's lower levels. The Inquisition's countermeasures were thorough, redundant, and had been tested against exactly this kind of scenario countless times over the millennia. But 7 seconds is longer than most people realize. In 7 seconds, a signal traveling at light speed covers more than 2 million kilometers. In 7 seconds, a message can be received by satellites, relay stations, ships passing through Terra's orbital space, any of the thousands of receiver arrays that monitor Imperial communication traffic for intelligence purposes. And though the vast majority of these potential recipients were part of the Imperium's own infrastructure, subject to the same countermeasures that had already begun erasing my transmission, there were others. Rogue traders with illegally modified equipment, tech priests engaged in forbidden research, and, most significantly, an Adeptus Mechanicus listening station on Mars that had been programmed centuries ago to monitor all electromagnetic emissions from Terra's crust for geological survey purposes and had never been updated to respect security. Classifications. The Martian station recorded my transmission in full, stored it alongside terabytes of seismic data and atmospheric measurements, and flagged it as anomalous due to its unusual frequency signature. The station's overseer, a minor magos named Hexus Velt, whose specialty was subsurface cartography, noticed the flag during a routine review 3 days after my death. He listened to the recording once, assuming it was some kind of malfunction or corrupted data, and then he listened to it again with growing disbelief. By the time he reached out to his contacts within the Mechanicus hierarchy, asking for verification of what he thought he had heard, the Inquisition was already aware of the breach. Velt disappeared the following night. His station was shut down permanently, its data cores wiped, its servitors mindless. But not before he had shared the recording with 2 colleagues he trusted. This is how truth survives. Not through grand revelation or heroic resistance, but through small, almost accidental acts of preservation, through copies made by curious minds before they understood the danger, through data cached in systems that were supposed to be temporary but somehow persisted, through the 1,000 tiny failures of a security apparatus that, despite its terrifying efficiency, could not account for every variable in a galaxy of billions. My transmission should have died with me, erased as thoroughly as my own existence would be erased, my name stricken from all records, my work attributed to others or simply lost. But it did not die. It lingered, fragmentary and corrupted, in the margins of the Imperium's vast information network, and eventually, someone would hear it. Centuries from now, perhaps, when the reclamation protocol was already in motion and the Emperor's final death had been rebranded as divine transformation, or millennia from now, when whatever replaced the Emperor had itself begun to fail and humanity's inheritors searched the past for warnings they had ignored. Or perhaps never. Perhaps my 7 seconds of desperate testimony would remain buried forever in forgotten data vaults, one more truth lost among millions, one more voice crying into darkness that would never answer. But I had spoken it. I had forced the Inquisition to acknowledge, if only for 7 seconds, that their conspiracy was vulnerable. I had proven that truth, once released, could not be perfectly controlled, that the Imperium's greatest lies required constant vigilance to maintain. And though that victory was smaller than dust, though it meant nothing to the billions who would die in the coming centuries to fuel a dying god, it was all I could offer. It was the only immortality I would ever know. The Emperor's true immortality, I understood in those final moments, was not the throne or the Astronomicon or the worship of trillions. It was the willingness of people like Kalane to commit any atrocity in his name, to sacrifice any principle in service of his preservation, to transform themselves into the very monsters the Imperium claimed to oppose, if it meant extending his half-life by even a single day. The Emperor endured not because of his own power, but because humanity could not bear to imagine existence without him, could not conceive of a future where the Golden Throne sat empty, and the warp storms closed in, and the last light went out forever. And so they fed him souls, and so they built machines to catch his dying breath, and so they transformed his suffering into theology and his agony into hope. I died on the floor of that chamber, surrounded by dreamers who would never wake, my blood mixing with the dust of Terra's deep foundations. Kaline watched until my heart stopped, verified my death with clinical precision. and then ordered her kill team to dispose of my body in the palace's crematorium, the same furnaces that consumed the physical remains of the psychers after the throne had burned out their souls. My ashes were mixed with theirs, scattered in the wind that blew across Terra's poisoned surface, and within hours it was as if I had never existed. The archives where I had worked were sealed and reclassified. My colleagues at Macragge received notification that I had died in transit, a common enough fate that no one questioned it, and Kalini filed her report, noting that the security breach had been contained, all contaminated personnel eliminated, and the project could continue without further disruption. But in the depths of the Mechanicus data warrens on Mars, in a forgotten cache that Velt had hidden before his death, my voice remained. 7 seconds of testimony, fragmented and corrupted but still comprehensible to anyone who knew how to listen. A ghost in the machine, waiting for someone to find it. A seed of doubt planted in the heart of the Imperium's greatest lie. The truth is that immortality requires sacrifice, and the Emperor's immortality required more sacrifice than any being should ever demand. 10,000 years of souls burned to keep one dying god breathing, 10,000 years of hope built on daily atrocity. And now, if Kaline and the Reclamation Protocol succeeded, another 10,000 years of the same horror under a different name, a different god, a different justification. The Imperium would survive, humanity would endure, and the cost would be measured in trillions. This is what I learned in the archives beneath Terra. This is what I tried to share before they silenced me. And this is what I leave behind, a ghost story recorded in 7 seconds, a warning that will almost certainly go unheeded, a voice crying in darkness that the light humanity worships is made of burning souls, and that the Emperor's greatest sacrifice was not his own immortality but theirs. The throne room itself lies far above the chamber where I died, far above the stockpiles of sleeping psychers and the maintenance levels where tech priests tend to machinery that should have failed millennia ago. It is a space of terrible grandeur, a cathedral built to house suffering so immense it bent reality around itself. I never saw it during my time on Terra. My work kept me in the archives, in the documentary shadows where truth accumulated like sediment, but I read descriptions from those who had witnessed the Emperor's broken form seated on his golden mechanism, surrounded by cascading energies and the psychic screams of psychers being consumed. They wrote about the smell, not of decay but of something being perpetually destroyed and perpetually renewed, flesh and essence caught in a loop of death and resurrection that never found completion. They wrote about the sound, a high-pitched whine that existed only partially in the material world, a frequency that made teeth ache and bones vibrate. They wrote about the light, blinding and wrong, like staring into a star that was simultaneously being born and dying. And they wrote about the Emperor's eyes, when his eyes could be seen through the crown of lightning that surrounded his head. They described them as being aware, conscious, present in a way that suggested his suffering was not the unconscious degradation of a comatose body, but the full and terrible experience of a mind trapped in unending torment. Some observers claimed they had felt him looking at them, had experienced the weight of his attention like a physical pressure, and had understood in that moment that he knew what was being done to him, knew that he was being used as fuel for a machine that would consume him forever and could do nothing to stop it. One custodian had written that he believed the Emperor was screaming, had been screaming for 10,000 years, and that the Astronomican's light was made partially from that scream, a wail of agony twisted into something humanity mistook for guidance. I cannot verify these accounts. I can only report what I read, what I extracted from testimony that was never meant to be public, what I pieced together from fragments of truth scattered across centuries of documentation. But if even a fraction of these descriptions are accurate, then the Emperor's immortality is not a miracle. It is the greatest war crime in human history, an atrocity of such scale and duration that it exceeds comprehension, and every human being who has lived in the Imperium, who has benefited from the Astronomican's light, or invoked the Emperor's name, or simply survived in the fragile bubble of space humanity carved from the galaxy's darkness, is complicit in it. We are all sustained by his suffering. We are all guilty of his endless death. This was the revelation that Kaline wanted me to help justify, The truth she wanted me to repackage into something more palatable, more necessary, more inevitable. She wanted me to write the historical analysis that would convince the remaining High Lords that replacing the Emperor was not only acceptable but urgent, that the current system was unsustainable, and that the Reclamation Protocol represented humanity's only hope. She wanted me to find precedents in pre-heresy history, to argue that the Emperor himself would have approved such measures, to craft a narrative that transformed murder into mercy and genocide into survival. And she wanted me to do it knowing that my analysis would be used to authorize the deaths of billions, that my words would become the intellectual foundation for atrocity, that I would be remembered, if I was remembered at all, as the historian who provided the scholarly justification for killing God. I think about what I might have written if I had agreed. I think about the arguments I could have made, the evidence I could have selected, the way I could have framed the Reclamation Protocol as a logical evolution of the Emperor's own contingency planning. I think about how easy it would have been to convince myself that I was serving some greater good, that my cooperation would ensure the project was implemented as humanely as possible, that refusing would accomplish nothing except my own death. I think about all the others who must have faced similar choices over the millennia, all the people who knew parts of the truth and decided that silence or complicity was more survivable than resistance. I think about how the Imperium survived, not through the strength of its institutions, but through the weakness of its consciences, through the 1,000 small surrenders that good people made when confronted with power they could not oppose. And I think about the Emperor, trapped on his throne, aware of everything being done in his name. I wonder if he regrets it. I wonder if, given the chance, he would choose oblivion over this eternal half-existence. I wonder if some part of him, buried deep beneath the agony and the machinery, hopes that someone will finally have the courage to let him die with dignity rather than perpetuate his torment for another 10,000 years. Or perhaps he has moved beyond such human concerns. Perhaps after millennia of consuming souls and holding back the warp through sheer psychic force, there is nothing left of the man who united terror and dreamed of a rational future. Perhaps what sits on the throne now is simply hunger, a mechanism of consumption wrapped in the memory of purpose, and the question of suffering or dignity is meaningless. These are the thoughts that occupied my mind as I lay dying in that chamber, my life bleeding out onto ancient stone. These are the doubts that Colleen tried to eliminate when she pulled the trigger. But doubts, like truth, are harder to kill than flesh. They persist in the spaces between certainty, in the gaps where official narratives cannot quite explain everything, in the quiet moments when people wonder if the Imperium's survival is truly worth its cost. My transmission was such a doubt, 7 seconds of uncertainty injected into the Imperium's information bloodstream. And though it will almost certainly be overcome by the stronger narrative, the official story that explains everything and demands nothing but faith, it will remain as a possibility, a question mark that some future scholar might notice and wonder about. Kalani was right about one thing. The Reclamation Protocol will proceed. The machinery is already in motion. The decisions made at levels far above anything I could influence. The Emperor will die, probably within my lifetime if I had survived, probably as part of some carefully orchestrated event that will be presented as his final sacrifice and humanity's greatest triumph. The Gestalt consciousness will be activated, billions of souls woven together into an artificial god designed to anchor the Astronomicon without requiring the Emperor's presence. And if it works, if the new entity proves stable and sufficient, then the Imperium will have successfully replaced its founder with an engineered substitute, and future generations will worship this synthetic god without ever knowing that their salvation was purchased with the largest mass sacrifice in human history. And if it fails, if the Gestalt consciousness proves unstable or insufficient or collapses under its own complexity, then the Imperium will face the warp storms without any psychic lighthouse to guide them, and humanity will fracture into isolated pockets scattered across a galaxy suddenly grown dark and impassable. The long night will return, worse than before. And this time, there will be no emperor to unite the scattered tribes, no great crusade to rebuild from the ashes. There will only be slow extinction, system by system, as isolated human populations fall to xenos predation or warp corruption or simple entropy. The Imperium will have gambled everything on the reclamation protocol, and if the gamble fails, humanity dies. This is the choice Kaline and her collaborators have made. They have decided that the risk of doing nothing, of allowing the current system to fail gradually over centuries, is greater than the risk of attempting a catastrophic transition all at once. They have decided that the Emperor's suffering, however immense, is less important than humanity's survival, and they have decided that the truth of what they are doing must be hidden at all costs, because if the Imperium's citizens knew that their leaders were planning to kill the Emperor and replace him with an untested warp mechanism, the resulting chaos would destroy humanity more surely than any external threat. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps this is the only way. Perhaps the moral calculus of galactic survival requires accepting atrocities that would be unthinkable on smaller scales. Perhaps I am simply too small-minded to understand the necessity of what they plan, too attached to outdated concepts of individual dignity and informed consent to see the larger picture. Perhaps my 7 seconds of testimony will be remembered, if they are remembered at all, as the naive objections of someone who did not understand the stakes. But I spoke them anyway. I recorded the truth as I understood it, knowing it would likely accomplish nothing, knowing I would die for it, knowing the Imperium would continue regardless of my resistance. I spoke them because silence was not an option, because complicity would have destroyed something in me that I valued more than survival, because the alternative was to become another Kaline, another person who justified horror in the name of necessity until horror became ordinary and necessity became indistinguishable from sadism. The Emperor's immortality is a lie. Not because he is not, in some sense, immortal, but because what immortality means in his case is so different from what the Imperium claims. He does not endure as a protector watching over humanity through the long night. He endures as fuel, as raw material, as the battery that powers a failing system. His consciousness, if it still exists in any coherent form, is subsumed into the machinery of his own preservation, and the billions who worship him worship not a god but a corpse, not a protector but a prisoner, not eternal life but eternal death. And now they will kill even that, will extinguish the last flickering remnants of whatever the Emperor once was, and will replace him with something that never lived to begin with, a synthetic consciousness assembled from the forced merger of trillions of unwilling participants. The new god will have no history, no identity, no will beyond what its creators program into it. It will be, in every meaningful sense, a machine, and the Imperium will have completed its transformation from a civilization that worships a man who became a god into a civilization that worships a machine pretending to be one. This is the future I tried to warn against. This is the truth I died to preserve. And somewhere in the Martian data vaults, in a cache that will likely remain hidden for centuries, my voice waits to be discovered. 7 seconds of testimony, fragmented and distorted by transmission errors and counter-intrusion protocols, but still audible to anyone with the right equipment and the willingness to listen. A ghost haunting the Imperium's information infrastructure, a seed of doubt that might someday germinate, or might not. The galaxy is vast, and human attention is finite. Most secrets remain buried forever, not because they are successfully suppressed, but because no one bothers to look for them. The reclamation protocol will proceed, the Emperor will die, the new god will be activated, and the Imperium will declare it a miracle, because the alternative is to admit that their entire civilization is built on a foundation of calculated atrocity. And my testimony will remain in the dark, one more forgotten voice among billions, one more truth that could not quite break through the noise. But I spoke it, I recorded it, I transmitted it into the void, and that will have to be enough. The catacombs where I died will be sealed, the chamber with its coffins full of dreaming psychers locked away behind reinforced doors and warning glyphs. The kill team that executed me will be reassigned, their memories of the incident chemically suppressed or redacted. Standard procedure for operations involving classified information. Kaline will continue her work, moving on to the next phase of the reclamation protocol, recruiting new analysts to replace me, preparing the documentation that will justify what is to come. And the Emperor will continue his 10,000-year death, fed souls by the thousand each day, held together by machinery that grows more desperate and inefficient with each passing hour, waiting for the moment when the Inquisition finally decides that his usefulness has ended and his suffering can be weaponized one final time. I wish I could say I had faith that my actions would matter. I wish I could claim that truth always prevails, that lies cannot stand forever, that eventually the Imperium would have to confront what it had done and what it was planning to do. But I read too much history to believe in such comforting fictions. The Imperium has survived for 10,000 years precisely because it is very good at not confronting uncomfortable truths, very skilled at maintaining useful lies, very efficient at eliminating anyone who threatens to disturb the cognitive frameworks that keep billions of people compliant and obedient. My testimony is just one more inconvenient fact to be managed, one more voice to be silenced, one more life to be erased in service of the greater machinery. And yet, in 7 seconds I spoke. In 7 seconds, I forced the Imperium to acknowledge my existence, to respond to my resistance, to spend resources hunting me through the dark. In 7 seconds, I became something more than just another archivist, another functionary, another replaceable component in the vast bureaucratic engine. I became a problem, and problems, even small ones, even ones that are quickly solved, leave traces. They create ripples in the historical record, anomalies that future investigators might notice, questions that might someday be asked again by someone else standing where I stood, reading what I read, facing the same terrible choices. The Emperor's immortality will end, whether through the Reclamation Protocol or through simple systemic collapse, whether in triumph or in catastrophe, whether remembered as salvation or forgotten entirely, it will end. Nothing lasts forever, not even gods, not even lies as vast and carefully maintained as the one at the heart of the Imperium. And when it ends, when the Golden Throne sits empty and humanity must finally confront what it has done and what it has become, perhaps someone will find my 7 seconds. Perhaps someone will listen to a dead man's testimony and understand that the ending was not inevitable, that choices were made, that people knew the truth and chose to hide it. Or perhaps not. Perhaps my voice will remain buried forever, one more ghost in a galaxy full of ghosts, one more warning that went unheeded. Perhaps the Reclamation Protocol will succeed beyond the Inquisition's expectations, and future generations will worship their synthetic god with genuine devotion, never knowing that their prayers are directed at an engineered consciousness that has no capacity to hear them. Perhaps the lie will become the truth simply through repetition, and the Emperor's actual history will fade into myth and legend, another story that no one quite believes but everyone remembers. But I will know. In whatever comes after death, if anything comes after death, I will know that I tried. I will know that when faced with the choice between complicity and resistance, between survival and integrity, between comfortable lies and dangerous truths, I chose the path that led to this cold chamber floor, this spreading pool of blood, this final moment of consciousness before the dark closes in completely. The Emperor's immortality was built on sacrifice. 10,000 years of psychers burned as fuel, 10,000 years of hope purchased with souls, 10,000 years of humanity surviving by consuming itself, by feeding its young into the machinery of its own preservation, by transforming worship into atrocity and faith into murder. And I refuse to help make it last another 10,000 years. That is my immortality. Not in documents or data caches or fragmentary transmissions scattered across the void, but in the simple fact of having refused. In having said no when everyone else said yes. In having walked away from Kaline's offer even knowing the cost. In having spent my final minutes ensuring that the truth, however briefly, however weakly, had been spoken aloud and recorded for anyone who might someday wish to listen. The light is fading now. The chamber grows dim. I can no longer feel my legs, and my hands have gone numb. I can hear Kaline speaking to her team, giving orders for body disposal and evidence cleanup, her voice clinical and detached. I can hear the dreamers in their coffins, breathing softly in their suspended sleep, waiting for the day they will be dragged before the throne and burned. I can hear, very faintly, the distant hum of Terra's deep machinery, the pulse of the world engine that keeps this planet alive, the same machinery that connects to the throne through kilometers of conduits and relays, carrying power up and souls down in an endless circulation. And beneath all of that, so quiet I am not sure if I am hearing it or hallucinating it, I hear something that might be screaming, a sound that exists at the edge of perception, too low or too high or too alien to register consciously, but present nonetheless. A sound that might be the Emperor's voice, broadcast across every psychic wavelength, a wail of agony that has lasted 10 millennia and will continue until someone finally grants him the mercy of true death. I hope he knows, somehow, that I tried. I hope some fragment of his consciousness, buried deep beneath the layers of pain and machinery, registered my testimony and understood what I was attempting. I hope that when the reclamation protocol is activated and his millennia of suffering finally end, his last coherent thought is not of betrayal or defeat, but of relief that someone, at last, had cared enough about his agony to risk everything opposing it. But I do not know. I cannot know. The Emperor's mind, if it still exists, is beyond my ability to understand or contact. He is as distant from me as a star, as incomprehensible as the warp itself. I can only hope that my gesture, tiny and futile as it was, registered in some way that mattered. The darkness is almost complete now. My vision has narrowed to a tunnel, and at the far end I see Kalini's face, her expression still neutral, still professional, watching as I die with the same clinical interest she might show observing a chemical reaction. She is not cruel. She is not sadistic. She is simply someone who has made her choice and will live with it, who has decided that the Imperium's survival justifies any cost and that individual suffering, however immense, is acceptable when weighed against extinction. She is, in her own way, a true believer. And perhaps that makes her more dangerous than any heretic, any traitor, any enemy humanity has ever faced. I close my eyes. I stop fighting the encroaching darkness. I let myself fall into it, grateful that at least my own death will be quick and clean compared to what awaits the psychers around me. And in my last moment of consciousness, I think about the great lie at the heart of the Imperium, the terrible truth I spent my life cataloguing and my death trying to expose. The Emperor's immortality is not a blessing. It is a curse that humanity inflicted upon him, a torture that has lasted 10,000 years and will continue until someone has the courage to end it. And when that ending comes, whether through the reclamation protocol or some other means, humanity will have to face the question of what kind of civilization builds its survival on the eternal suffering of its founder, what kind of species transforms its savior into fuel, what kind of faith demands the annihilation of the very thing it claims to worship. I will not be there to see how humanity answers that question, but I have left my testimony. 7 seconds of truth, hidden in the data vaults, waiting for someone to find it. 7 seconds that say what no one else was willing to say, that name the horror everyone else chose to ignore, that refuse to let the lie stand unchallenged even when challenge is futile. The Emperor's immortality is a holocaust made eternal, and I died trying to stop it from continuing forever. That is my legacy. That is my truth. That is all I have to offer the future.